At the will reading, my parents slid a $10 million check across the polished table to my sister. Then they turned to me with a smile that cut like glass and said, "Go earn your own." I sat frozen, pulse hammering in my ears, until Grandpa's lawyer stood up. He pulled out a sealed envelope with my name on it. The room shifted. My mother's smile shattered. She started screaming before a single word was read. That was the moment everything I thought I knew about my family cracked wide open. I'm Solace Marin, and this is my story. Before I share it, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments or tell me where you're from. Sometimes even a single word can remind me I'm not alone. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. If my story speaks to you, please hit subscribe. Every time you follow, comment, or share, it helps my voice reach further than the walls that once tried to silence me. The Marin estate in Hanover, New Hampshire, gleamed with polished marble floors and walls lined with oil. Portraits of ancestors I never felt related to. The entire family gathered for the will reading after my grandmother's passing, along with attorneys, advisors, and a few carefully chosen representatives of the Marin Foundation's board. Everyone looked at home in the grandeur except me. I sat stiff in a suit that felt borrowed from someone else's life, painfully aware that my place here had been earned, not by respect, but by obligation. I've always been the outsider in my family, the son who didn't join the family business, the one who preferred questions over profit, soil samples over stock charts. To them, I was the driftwood child washed up on their pristine shore by accident. Even the invitation to the will reading had been nothing more than a copied email sent at the last minute, like a reminder to take out the trash. Delaney, my sister, thrived in this room. She was praised, endlessly painted as the moral heir to the family's legacy, the golden child who never faltered. People leaned toward her, laughed at her rehearsed jokes, called her the embodiment of Marin values. I watched her soak it in every smile, a rehearsed performance for an audience that adored her. The lawyer cleared his throat, the air tightening. To Delaney Vale Marin, he announced, "We leave $10 million in the position of overseeing the Marin Foundation." Polite applause circled the room, and I felt the weight of eyes turning toward me in anticipation. My father's hand rested smugly on my mother's wrist. They already knew what was coming. And to Solace Marin, the lawyer continued scanning the page. The note reads simply, "Solace is bright. He'll build his own." I sat frozen. My face betrayed nothing, but my chest burned. The words echoed in my head like a slap. Build my own. That was their way of saying, you are not one of us. Earn your worth outside these walls. I forced myself to stay composed, though inside I was hollow, humiliated. My sister smirked without even trying to hide it. My mother glanced at me with that look, half pity, half satisfaction. My father crossed his legs, uninterested, already moving on. And then a shift. Arthur Lindley, my grandfather's private attorney, rose from his chair. His voice was steady, deliberate. "There is one more document. It does not belong to the official estate records. It was submitted 6 years ago under explicit instruction that it be opened only in the presence of Solace." My mother shot up, panic cracking her poise. "We agreed that would not be read." Her voice sliced through the polished calm, trembling with a fear I had never seen in her. Arthur ignored her. From his briefcase, he pulled out a wax-sealed envelope, yellowed with time. My throat tightened when I saw the handwriting. Bold, deliberate strokes. My grandfather's hand. He placed it gently in front of me. To Solace, it read on the front. "For when it matters most." My fingers trembled as I reached for it, aware that every pair of eyes in the room was on me, and that whatever lay inside had the power to unravel everything I thought I knew. I left New Hampshire the next morning, the envelope still sealed, but heavy in my pocket. My grandfather's instructions pointed me west toward a place that had lived in memory more than reality, Santa Fe, New Mexico. I hadn't been back since my teenage summers, back when the ranch was a sanctuary of dirt roads, sunburned afternoons, and the smell of Moe's quiet wood smoke. It was also the place I'd been quietly forbidden to return to, as if my visits had never existed. The ranch hadn't changed. The adobe walls were weathered, the gate crooked, the magnolia tree in the yard twisted eastward as always. But walking up to that porch didn't feel like coming home. It felt like approaching a locked vault of memories. When the door opened, I braced for silence. Instead, I heard her voice, sharp, unforgiving. "So, you finally decided to show up." My grandmother, Elma, stood there, arms crossed, eyes like flint. She had been warmth once, a force of stories and laughter. Now, her face carried only cold restraint. I stammered, "Grandma, I came as soon as she cut me off." Bitterness in her voice. "Jacob called for you every day on his deathbed. He asked for you. We thought you were too busy, that you had a new life. No time for an old man's goodbye." My throat clenched. "That's not true. I never got a call. Not one." She turned away, disappearing into the living room, leaving me rooted at the threshold. When she returned, she held a worn leather notepad, its pages curled at the edges. She flipped to the back and jabbed a finger at the last page. Rows of careful handwriting, dates, times, and the same number dialed again and again. I stared. It wasn't mine. Not even close. I had kept the same number since college. Elma's voice wavered. "They told us you changed it, that you didn't want to be found, that you were ashamed of us." The realization hit me like a punch. Delaney. She had always been near Grandpa, always. Managing his phone, his appointments. She had swapped the number. Every call meant for me had been swallowed by her. Interference. My chest hollowed out. The conversations I thought had never come. The silence I thought was his choice. None of it had been real. They hadn't let me be there. Elma sank into the armchair, her hands trembling. "He asked for you until his last breath." I couldn't breathe. My voice cracked. "I didn't know. I swear. I didn't know." The room seemed to collapse inward, heavy with the weight of lost time. I followed Elma into the old barn that smelled of dust and oil, a place I hadn't stepped into since I was 14. Amidst the clutter, I found a box, labeled with my name. Inside were files, sketches, and blueprints. An entire design for an ecological research center. On the top page, in my grandfather's hand, "When Solace is ready, this land is his." I dug deeper and uncovered an old hard drive. My palms sweated as I plugged it into a rusted laptop still sitting on the workbench. The screen flickered, and then his voice filled the room. Jacob Marin's voice, steady but faint with age. "Don't let your name exist only in their system. Carve it into the soil with your own hands. This land will remember you, even if they choose not to." I sat down hard on the wooden stool, the dry air burning my eyes. Night crept in outside, the desert wind howling across the fields. I stepped out onto the cracked earth sky, stretched wide above me, stars burning cold and distant. I lowered myself onto the dirt. It was dry, fractured, forgotten, and yet under the moonlight, it felt alive, like it had been waiting. Something shifted inside me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was a call I had ignored too long. A call to return, to build, to become more than the silence they had left me in. That night, staring at the desert sky, I knew the envelope had led me here for a reason. And for the first time in years, I felt the ground beneath me answer back. The ranch was quiet except for the steady groan of the windmill and the dry shuffle of leaves against the adobe walls. I had been living among boxes for a week, sorting through decades of forgotten papers, rusted tools, jars of preserved soil samples, notebooks stacked in uneven piles. Dust clung to everything, and every object I touched seemed to carry both weight and accusation. One afternoon, while clearing out the far shelf in the barn, I found it. A small faded notebook with a cracked leather cover. My breath caught when I realized what it was, a summer notebook. I was 13 when my grandfather gave it to me. We had spent long afternoons kneeling in the dirt, measuring moisture levels, recording how soil organisms changed under heat, laughing when our little glass jars exploded from gas buildup. He had written his findings in neat block letters, while mine were crooked, messy, but always eager. This notebook had been our private record, the proof of a summer that had belonged only to us. As I opened it, my stomach tightened. Many pages were intact, still filled with our notes and observations. But others were violently scarred. Some had been ripped out. Others were slashed with heavy black ink. Entire sections blotted into nothing. My handwriting was still visible in places, half words drowned under deliberate strokes. Someone had tried to erase those summers, to make it look like they never mattered. My chest burned as I imagined Elaine's perfectly manicured hands, flipping through it, deciding which pieces of my childhood could survive and which had to be destroyed. I carried the notebook back to the house and turned on the old laptop I had dug up. On the hard drive my grandfather left me, I found a folder labeled with my initials. Inside were scanned pages, digital copies of the notebook before it had been mutilated. Every diagram, every crooked line, every shaky calculation was preserved. Alongside them was a file, a draft email, dated the year I turned 18. It had been addressed to my personal inbox with the scans attached and a note. Keep these safe, Solace. They belong to you. The email had never reached me. My hands trembled as I checked the metadata. The address was correct, but in the internal system, it had been rerouted, replaced with an alternate account under my name that I had never owned. My access had been cut off the moment I entered college. My connection to him had been severed deliberately, my identity erased. In places where it mattered most, I felt sick as the realization settled over me. Someone had removed me not only from phone calls, but from the written record of his trust. I flipped to the back of the notebook. In my grandfather's hand, a note remained untouched. They thought it was weakness to ask too many questions. But those who never ask will never make anything new. The words hit me like a hand on my shoulder from across time. A reminder that my curiosity had never been the problem. It had always been my strength. In the same box, rolled up and nearly forgotten, was a large map. I spread it across the workbench, the edges curling like old parchment. My grandfather's meticulous pen had drawn out regions of land plots marked with symbols and notes. My eyes stopped at a red circle near Portland, Oregon. Beside it, in bold letters, he had written Phase 2 expansion. I traced the circle with my finger. It wasn't just about this ranch in Santa Fe. He had envisioned something larger, a network of research hubs that could link communities and soil projects across states. He had been planning for me to carry it forward to grow the work beyond one man's reach. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open beside me, the map spread across the wood, the hard drive glowing faintly in the dim light. I thought about my sister's smirk in that New Hampshire parlor, my mother's scream, my father's silence. I thought about every erased page, every silenced call. And then I thought about this map, these plans, this quiet vote of confidence from a man who had seen me when no one else did. I made my decision. I would build the center exactly as he had designed it, not for vengeance, not to humiliate them, but to create something so undeniable they could never erase me again. A week later, the ranch looked less like an abandoned relic and more like a place stirring back to life. The barn was cleared, the dust swept out of corners that hadn't seen light in years. I had unpacked the equipment left behind: microscopes, polished test tubes, aligned soil samples relabeled. For the first time since his death, the place breathed again. That morning, my grandmother Alma made calls. By afternoon, the familiar sound of car doors echoed through the dry air. I stayed in the kitchen, hands braced on the edge of the table, listening as the front door opened and footsteps crossed. The wooden floor. Delaney's voice rang first, dripping with mockery. So this is what he left. You. A barn full of dirt. My mother followed her tone, sweetened with condescension. It smells exactly the same as it always did. How quaint. My father's voice was low, even as though calculating. I thought this matter was already settled. Grandma Elma's voice cut sharp. Sit down. There is one more note Jacob left. To be read, but only when all of you were here. The room grew quieter as chairs scraped the floor. Arthur Lindley, steady as ever, produced another envelope from his case. He adjusted his glasses, broke the seal, and began to read. Jacob Marin leaves the Santa Fe ranch, the research equipment, and the Marin. Rawing fund to his grandson, Solace Marin. The words fell like stones in still water. My mother's face hardened. My father shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Delaney shot to her feet, voice rising in fury. This is insane. It should have been mine. I was the one who stayed by his side. I was the one who cared for him. He promised me. I stepped forward, my voice steady, but edged with years of silence. You didn't care for him. You controlled him. You changed his number so I couldn't be reached. You cut me off. Delaney's face flushed. That's a lie. I pulled out the hard drive, opened the file, and let Jacob's voice fill the room. I've called the number she gave me. Again and again. No answer, no response. I don't understand why Solace doesn't want to talk to me. The recording ended in static. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at the floor, jaw tight. My mother exploded, slamming her hand against the table. This proves nothing. You have no authority here. That lawyer has no right to distribute anything. But Elma stood her back straight, her voice trembling, not with weakness, but with fire. Enough. My son told me once that the family would try to crush Solace. He said, if the boy ever came back, it would mean he had survived them, and here he is. She turned to them, her eyes cold and final. You will not take this from him. For the first time in my life, I looked at my family and did not feel fear. Their power, their wealth, their judgment. It all seemed hollow. What I saw in their faces now was not dominance, but exposure. The performance was over, and the truth was standing in front of them. The room hung frozen, every breath. I held their gaze steady and unflinching, and in that moment, I knew the silence they had forced on me was broken, and there was no going back. After the confrontation in the adobe house, they left. My father's silence trailed after him like a shadow. My mother's fury lingered in the air, and Delaney's glare promised more battles. I stayed behind. In Santa Fe, surrounded by boxes of papers, the echo of my grandfather's voice still ringing in my ears. For the first time, I felt the ranch wasn't abandoned. It was a place waiting to speak, and I was finally ready to listen. The local newspaper caught wind of what had happened. A headline appeared within days. Estranged grandson inherits scientific legacy. Neighbors I hadn't seen in decades stopped by. Curious, some supportive, others skeptical. Whispers spread through the community. What had once been a private struggle was now public, and with publicity came resistance. It didn't take long. A courier arrived one morning with a letter stamped by a firm I recognized. Delaney had filed through her own attorneys demanding the secondary will be voided. Her claim was blunt. The addendum was invalid, never registered through the corporate channels, and therefore unenforceable. I stared at the pages, my pulse steadying as the weight of what I had suspected became real. This wasn't going to end with signatures on paper. This was war. That night, I went through more of my grandfather's old files, searching for anything that could stand against the storm coming. In a cedar chest beneath stacks of soil reports, I found a folder labeled SMP. Inside was a certificate filed 6 years ago, registering Soil Memoir Project as an independent entity the beneficiary listed as me. He had done it quietly, hiding it away until the moment I was ready. The foresight was staggering. He had not only left me the land, he had armed me with the means to defend it. Scrolling deeper through the old hard drive, I uncovered another set of documents, emails written by my grandfather to Delaney. They were direct, pleading, "Do not interfere with Solace's contact. He needs to know I am calling." None of these messages had ever been disclosed, let alone acknowledged. My stomach churned as I imagined her deleting them, building her perfect narrative while he lay waiting for me to answer a phone that never rang. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how carefully the walls around me had been built and how determined my grandfather had been to dismantle them, even after he was gone. Then came the calls from reporters. First a small science magazine, then regional newspapers, then national outlets. They wanted to talk about Jacob, Marin's forgotten legacy, about me, about the Soil Memoir Project. I hesitated, aware that every word could ignite a bigger fire, but I also knew silence had been their weapon against me for too long. Refusing to speak would only serve them again. I gave my first interview sitting at the old ranch kitchen table. I spoke about soil, about community, about what my grandfather had built and what he had dreamed. But I also spoke about being cut off, about being silenced, about being forced to the margins of my own family. The article ran under the title "From Forgotten to Founder, the New Voice of the Marin Legacy." By the time the story spread, the choice was clear. I couldn't stay hidden in Santa Fe, waiting for the next legal blow. My grandfather had marked a red circle on a map near Portland for a reason. It was meant to grow beyond this ranch. He had given me the blueprint, and it was my turn to bring it to life. I packed the blueprints, the notebook, the certificate for Soil Memoir Project, and the hard drive. Leaving Santa Fe felt like tearing away roots, but it also felt like planting new ones elsewhere. I wasn't just a grandson inheriting papers anymore. I was a builder, and I was ready to construct something that could never again be erased. Portland smelled of rain and cedar. The warehouse I found wasn't much, just a hollow building with cracked windows and rusted beams. But when I stood inside, I could already imagine benches lined with equipment, walls filled with charts, and students leaning over microscopes. It would be the beginning of Soil Memoir Project, not as a relic of my grandfather's vision, but as a living continuation of it. I wasn't alone for long. Marisol, a quiet but sharp-eyed high school senior, showed up first, eager to learn. Ravi, a graduate student with more stubborn hope than resources, joined soon after. Tina, a single mother who had abandoned her own studies years ago, offered her time in exchange for the chance to be part of something real. Together, we swept, painted, rewired, and transformed the empty shell into a lab. Word traveled quickly. Articles described me as the grandson cast out, now rising to build a scientific hub. Some cheered, some scoffed, but everyone paid attention. That attention brought more than volunteers. It brought my family back into the picture. The lawsuit escalated. Delaney and my parents filed a new injunction demanding that I be barred from using the Marin name in any scientific project. They claimed I was tarnishing a reputation they had spent decades building. The hearing was set. For the first time, I would have to face them not in private kitchens or dusty ranch houses, but in the cold light of a courtroom with strangers watching. On the morning of the trial, I walked into the courthouse with Arthur Lindley by my side. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but I kept my head high. Inside, the benches filled with spectators, curious citizens, and journalists scribbling notes. My mother sat rigid, pearls around her neck, eyes full of disdain. My father looked straight ahead, emotionless. Delaney's posture radiated confidence, but her hands wouldn't stay still on the table. The arguments began. Their lawyer painted me as a deserter, a son who had abandoned his family, a name that no longer deserved protection. My mother rose and waved doctor documents, claiming they proved I had rejected all contact. The room buzzed with murmurs. The narrative they had built for years, now performed on a stage. When it was our turn, Lindley stood calm and steady. He played a recording. My grandfather's voice filled the chamber. If the Marin name must go on, let it be through solace. He is the only one who understands the soil. The rest of them only understand the stage. The silence afterward was heavier than any gavel. A former employee of the Marin Corporation then took the stand, voice shaking but firm. He described how Delaney had ordered changes to the internal contact system, rerouting calls and deleting records. The truth spoken out loud pierced through the polished armor. My family wore. I provided the emails, the ones my grandfather had sent Delaney, begging her not to interfere. They lit up the courtroom screens, undeniable and damning. Then Alma walked in. My grandmother, who had once doubted me, who had accused me of not showing up, took her place in the audience. When called to speak, she rose with a cane in her hand, her voice trembling but strong. Jacob trusted solace. I was wrong to be silent. I will not be silent again. I stand with him. The room fell into stillness. Reporters scribbled furiously, but I felt nothing except the pounding of my heart. I stood and looked at the judge, my family, the audience. For the first time, I let the words come without fear. I'm not here to beg for the Marin name, I said. I'm here to prove one thing. Legacy isn't in the applause of those who sit at the top. It's in the hands of the one who keeps planting, even when no one is watching. The judge's decision came quickly. Soil Memoir Project was declared mine, entirely legitimate and independent. The name was mine to carry, not because of their approval, but because it had been written in both law and truth. As my family filed out their faces, pale and defeated, I felt no triumph, only certainty. This wasn't the end. It was the opening chapter of a fight that would stretch far beyond a courtroom. They had tried to bury me under silence, but the ground had spoken back. And now it was my turn to keep planting. San Francisco smelled of salt and fog the morning I arrived for the Regenerative Agriculture Conference. The hotel ballroom had been transformed into a hall of banners, booths, and polished stages where every word was meant to echo across the industry. Soil Memoir Project had been granted a slot on the main stage. 3 years ago, no one would have believed it. Now reporters followed me with cameras, murmurs of curiosity rippling through the crowd. Backstage, I rehearsed quietly, notes spread out before me. My talk wasn't about numbers or prestige. It was about what my grandfather taught me. That soil carries memory, that kindness and care could be measured in roots and growth. This was my moment to share it with the world. The door creaked and Delaney slipped inside. She looked immaculate, her blazer sharp, her voice low and venomous. You'll fail out there, she whispered. These people believe in names, not strays. You don't have the credibility. All you have is a story. That won't hold. She gave me a thin smile and turned on her heel before I could answer. When I stepped onto the stage, the lights were blinding. Rows upon rows of faces stretched before me. Scientists, professors, students, journalists. My heart pounded, but I stood tall. I began to speak about soil, about the quiet miracles that happened beneath our feet, about memory etched into dirt by care and neglect alike. Midway through, my mother rose from her seat, pearls glinting, her voice cutting through the microphone's hum. You have no right to speak for this family. Everything you're doing is theft. You are nothing but a fraud wearing the Marin name. Gasps spread across the room, eyes shifting between us. I let the silence settle before I clicked the remote in my hand. Behind me, the screen filled with images from the summer. Notebook pages in my 13-year-old scrawl experiments scribbled beside my grandfather's neat annotations. Laughter scrolled in margins, diagrams of soil organisms drawn with unsteady hands. The room hushed. Then I read, aloud from a letter Jacob had written in his bold script. Solace is the seed. If the name Marin has meaning, it must sprout through him. My voice cracked, but didn't falter. For a moment, the ballroom was still. Then, from the back row, a cluster of young researchers began to clap. The applause spread, growing until it thundered, shaking the stage beneath me. Cameras swung toward my family. Their faces were pale, their certainty fractured. I closed with the words that had been living inside me for years. Legacy isn't a $10 million check. Legacy is when a child's question is treated as worth answering. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure no child is stripped of that right again. The ovation was deafening. I stood straighter than I ever had before. Not because I had their approval, but because I no longer needed it. For the first time, I realized I had an audience. Of my own, a community, a generation, and the echo of my grandfather's voice carried in the soil itself. 3 years passed like a season of growth. Soil Memoir Project had expanded into a federation of research centers across more than 10 states. What had begun in a dusty warehouse in Portland had become a network of labs, farms, and classrooms, where children in rural towns learned to look at soil through microscopes instead of outdated textbooks. I lived in a small wooden house beside our Portland campus, the smell of cedar and rain drifting through open windows. Elma had moved in with me, her pace slower, but her wit as sharp as ever. Each morning we drank coffee in the sun room, and I kept my grandfather's pocket watch in my jacket. His photograph of me at 10 tucked inside me, grinning beside a model beehive, project proof of who I had always been. Looking back, I remembered the boy my parents told to go earn your own, the one who sat humiliated at a polished table in New Hampshire. That boy had become a man who now handed out scholarships, built science camps, and gave kids a place where their questions weren't dismissed. One evening, an email arrived. It was from Delaney. The subject line read, "Only for the students." Her message was brief. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only want to help." Attached was a draft of a public speaking curriculum for shy students designed to help them find their voices. I stared at it for a long time before replying. I invited her to volunteer. She never apologized outright, but she showed up. Sometimes presence is its own language. My parents, Sterling and Candace, had retired to Florida. They appeared in glossy magazines as donors at charity galas. I didn't feel anger anymore, nor longing. Their world no longer touched mine. Months later, Elma handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a sealed envelope I had never seen before. On it, Jacob's handwriting. "Open when you understand the difference between inheritance and legacy." My hands shook as I unfolded the letter. His words burned into me. Inheritance is what people leave behind. Legacy is the map you draw for others to follow. You are that map. I read it while sitting on the old bench he had built with his hands under a wide New Mexico sky. The stars above me were real, not the glow-in-the-dark stickers of my childhood ceiling, but they stirred the same wonder. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was searching for his voice. I felt like I was carrying it. I whispered into the night. I had chased love where it never lived. But Jacob had left me something greater than love. Given conditionally, he had left me direction. He had turned my questions into a compass. The next morning, I watched students crowd into our lab, their eyes widening as microscopes revealed hidden worlds, their notebooks filled with diagrams messy and bright like mine had once been. In them, I saw a future my family had tried to erase but couldn't. I didn't need them to call me son or brother or heir. I had been called something else now. A sewer, a builder, a keeper of questions, and that was enough. I never imagined my life would turn this way. For years, I thought my story ended the day my parents pushed a check across the table to my sister and told me to go earn your own. That moment felt like a burial, a clean eraser. I believed the Silence that followed proved their judgment true. But what I've learned walking through ranch houses filled with dust, through courtrooms where truth had to claw its way to light, through stages where my voice shook before it steadied, is that silence can be broken. And when it finally is, it carries more power than any scripted applause. I think back, often to that 13-year-old boy with dirt under his fingernails, scribbling notes in the summer notebook, asking questions no one wanted to hear. He didn't know then that those questions would one day define him, or that his persistence to ask, even when ignored, would become the thread tying his entire life together. What my family called weakness, curiosity, sensitivity, hunger for meaning, was the very thing that kept me alive when their acceptance was denied. It became the seed my grandfather watered quietly without fanfare, knowing someday it would grow. And that's what I want you to hear most. You don't need permission from the people who refuse to see you. You don't need to wait for their applause, their validation, or their titles. Legacy isn't carved into polished marble or hidden inside trust funds. Legacy is the map you draw with your own footsteps, the questions you refuse to stop asking, the seeds you plant, knowing you may not be there to watch them bloom. I know some of you listening feel invisible in your own families, in your workplaces, in your communities. Maybe you've been told you're not enough, that you don't belong, that someone else holds the claim to the spotlight. I know the pain of that. I carried it for years like a stone in my chest. But I also know what it means to let that stone fall, to set it down, and walk away lighter. What I built wasn't revenge. It wasn't about winning against them. It was about creating a place where no child would ever be told their questions didn't matter. It was about giving back what I had almost lost. 3 years into Soil Memoir Project, I walk into classrooms where students press their faces to microscopes for the first time. I see the spark when they realize the soil beneath their feet is alive. I hear them say, "I didn't know science could belong to me." And I think this is the legacy my grandfather meant. Not a fortune in a bank account, but a future that outlives us all. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Don't measure yourself by the hands that withheld love. Measure yourself by the work you choose to give the world, by the voices you choose to lift, by the questions you keep alive when others dismiss them. That's where the real inheritance is. That's where legacy lives. I've shared something close to my heart here, and I hope it reaches yours. If you felt even a flicker of recognition, if you saw yourself in my silence, in my questions, or in my fight to be seen, let me know. Leave a hi in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes knowing you're out there makes all the difference. It reminds me that the story doesn't end with me. It continues in each person who hears it and carries it forward. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe forgotten voices deserve to be heard, I invite you to subscribe. Every follow, every share, every word of encouragement helps push this voice further than the walls that once tried to contain it. I'm not just telling my story for myself. I'm telling it for every child who sat at a polished table and was told to go earn their own, for every person who thought their questions were too small to matter. So join me. Walk with me in this. Carry these questions into your own soil, your own families, your own communities. Because one day someone will look back and see the map you left behind. And maybe, just maybe, they'll whisper what I've finally learned to say without shame. I was never invisible. I was always the sewer. And that is enough. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family, as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter. Your voice does too.